In this tutorial, I want to show you guys some of my favorite advanced parameters in the amp block of the Axe FX3. To get started, I'm using the Recto 1 Orange Modern with these York Audio impulses, which are stock in the cab block. If you haven't got the most recent beta release of Axe FX3 Edit, go to the forum and grab it. There's a couple of cool extra features, namely you can see the cab block has changed a little bit to make it easier to mute and unmute cabinets, which is really, really handy. There's also the quick build feature if you want to add blocks just by dropping and dragging, which I love. But we're not here to do that today. We're here to have a listen to some tones. This is how I've got the amp set up at the moment. So a pretty filthy, chunky rectifier kind of tone. It's got all the characteristics that you would expect from that amp. It's got quite a fizzy high end. It's a very, very muddy in the low end. And if I was using this, with what I like to do, if I was using it in a mix to record with or I was using it live, I'd want to tighten up that low end and kind of smooth out some of the fizz. So here's a couple of different ways we can do it. The basic menu, and this is one of the best things about the Axe FX3, is I think it already sounds so good just by using the basic menu and a simple IR. But if we go into the Preamp tab, straight away we've got one of my favorite features in the amp block, which is this input boost section. So on the AX8 and the Axe FX2 and all the way back to the Axe FX Standard and Ultra, there was a boost function, which was just a flat gain boost. And we can do that just by choosing neutral. For example, the settings at the moment, it will just add 12 dB of preamp gain. But you can hear by doing that, it just kind of muddies the sound up even more, compresses it in a way which isn't going to work great if you're playing with a full band. So what I like to do is, there's a couple of different options we've got here, from the AC boost all the way down to the T808 mod. My favorite type of pre-boost is the Super Overdrive. So rather than have to add a block to the grid, I can do this in the amp block and I can change the boost level. So let's try this off and then on. So you can hear there's a couple of blocks which have a different character going on each time. What this actually does is it emulates setting up a drive block with the drive at 0, and this control here becomes just a level control. So it's like a simplified version of that. You can hear the Super Overdrive tightens up the lows, smooths out some of that fizz in the high end and gives you a nice mid bump. And by pushing the mids, that will help you kind of pop out in the mix a little bit. So that is the preamp section, and that's about all I tweak in the preamp. In the power amp section, there's a couple of controls, namely the power tube type, which are really cool. They give you a very subtle variation on what's going on. So for example, if you wanted a Recto with KT88s, we can have a listen to what that would sound like. So that's pretty cool. Again, it's pretty subtle. The transformer match is another great parameter. If you lower it, and you only need to lower it by like 0.1 or 0.2, have a listen to this. kind of simulates like an impedance mismatch between an amp and a cabinet. I like it at about 1.1, just again, because it kind of smooths everything out a little bit. You might like it lower or higher, and you don't need to tweak it very much. So that's what's going on in the power amp. The power supply section with this amp, I tweak quite considerably, because I think it helps me get the axe closer to the way my actual Rev G rectifier sounds. Rectos have this switch in them which essentially can switch between solid state and tube rectification. I don't know if the model in the Axe FX3 is modeled with solid state or tube rectification, but I find that turning the supply sag up is going to get me close to that kind of tube rectifier squishy thing that Rectos have. For example, we'll start it here at about 2, and then I'll take it up to 6. And for me, this is just where the action is. It makes it feel so much more like an actual rectifier on the tube rectification settings. And that just feels so glorious to play. Another thing that the old rectifiers have is the bold and spongy switch, and I find that using the Variac to about 75% kind of emulates that spongy setting. So at 100 and then 75, you do lose a bit of volume with it, so I'll try adjust that. Oh, that feels really, really good to play. So with the Recto, with the Plexis, with the Fender amps, I normally like to turn the supply sag up quite a bit, and I'll play around with the Variac as well, just to kind of get the feel that I like. I love it with the Recto, though. These settings for me kind of really, really take it from being good to being great. So that's what we've got going with the power supply. In the speaker section, one thing you might want to play around with the Recto is lowering the low frequency resonance here. So normally I like this at the stock settings, but you know, depending on the type of cabinet that you're using, like in the real world, if you're using a real Recto and a real cabinet, that amp head and cabinet combination essentially is going to have a particular resonant frequency in a particular room. So if you take this down to about 85 hertz, it changes the character of the low end, and kind of this just kind of changes where that thump frequency is, and it can be really good if you're playing direct to get a little bit more of that you know, low end thump that you'd associate with an amp and a cabinet. So have a listen to that. And you can hear that raising again kind of gives it more of like a, I'd almost describe it as like a kind of chesty sound happening. And yeah, I like that. If you were using, for example, like an orange cab IR, you might want to turn the low frequency resonance up. If you were using like a vintage Marshall, you might want to bring it down. Depending on what you're doing, that's a really powerful control to control the low end. The speaker drive section, this speaker compression with the Recto, I don't normally play around with too much because I normally, as you can see, run the master volume quite low. So that's not going to have a huge impact on what's going on, but turning the speaker compression up in general, again, it's one of those things where it can help you simulate literally the compression characteristics that you would get with a real amp and a real cab. I feel like by cranking the supply sag and the Variac, I've kind of already done some of that, but let's just have a listen to what this does anyway. Let's have a listen. So So with the Recto, it doesn't do too much, but we are going to come back. I'll use a non-master volume amp to play around with that. Normally, the stock setting's fine with that, but that is one we are going to come back to. Right, moving on, I think one of my favorite new parameters in here, again, kind of like the input drive, is this input EQ. And this is so cool. Again, it can help us shape the low end and the mid range in a really powerful way, as well as changing the gain structure. So basically the input EQ, what we can do is I like to start with the frequency at about 800 hertz. And what we're going to do is roll off a bunch of low end. So we will say let's go extreme. We'll go 150 hertz. Let's just have a listen to what that does. And that is pretty cool. That's tightened up that low end again. But what we can do now is push this 800 hertz frequency band, say by like 6 dB. And I mean, if you've ever played around with like a Fort and Grind pedal or an old, who used to make it? Furman, I think. They had like a parametric EQ, a rack bass unit that a bunch of guys in the 80s used to use. This was kind of the trick that they used. So this is what that does. And if you want to kind of get this mid-range frequency, have this effect happen over a wider set of frequencies, increase the Q. Lower the Q, wrong way around. What I like to try to go for visually is basically a straight line here. So this is what that does when we lower the Q a bit. You can also play around with the definition control, which is going to basically change, as you can see visually, it kind of changes. It's almost like a tilt control. So with it low, and that's how you can kind of emulate that. I guess it's quite a hip modern thing to do. Like I said, kind of like the Fort and Grind trick. If you've got a lot of low end in your guitar going in, you can take that out and really help you shape the character of the gain. Finally, the output EQ, you can choose between different graphic EQ types. One thing which is kind of cool is using the 5-band Mark Series EQ with something like a rectifier, and you can use it to push certain mid-frequency bands or pull out low end. You know, the Recto is quite a muddy amp, so let's turn this input EQ off. So I'll set that back to 0. Is that what I want? Is that what I want it to look like? Where was the low cut? About 13. So something like that. And what I'll do, I'll turn my input boost on again. So this is what it's sounding like so far, which is pretty cool. If we wanted to, we might want to pull out, say, a bit of 240. At the same time, we boost a bit of 2200. Or we could go for something like, you know, the 7-band constant Q EQ, and basically kind of, again, this is going to give you more of a surgical kind of tool to pull out certain frequencies. Even let's go for the 8-band. Let's go with constant Q. That's pretty cool. So for example, with this particular sound, again, it's a little bit muddy in the low mids. Again, you could just change to a different amp model. It might be easier, but these tweaks are cool to know. Pulling out a bit of 4K kind of helps. Pulling out a bit of 250 helps. And, you know, just pushing, well, that's probably way too much. Like between 1 and 2 dB normally kind of works. Yeah, that's pretty good. And then we can add in a little bit of 2K, a little bit of 1K, push those mids. Sounds like this. I could do the same thing, but instead of the input boost, I could use the input EQ the way I had it, add a bit of low cut in there. These are really, really powerful tools for helping shape. In this case, the input EQ is going to change the character of the gain, like I said before, and the output EQ you can use to sort of like pull out or add in anything that you think is missing from the overall frequency character of your guitar. I said frequency character of your guitar. I meant guitar tone, meaning, you know, the guitar and the amp. So there you go. That's a tour of the advanced parameters in the amp block that I use quite a lot. One final one, the dynamic depth and presence are really cool to play around with. I'll do those in another video because I haven't found myself using them too much just yet. Same thing as like the compression and harmonics controls. So once I've actually kind of done a bit of a deep dive there myself and had a look and see if, it's worthwhile. Most of these parameters are worthwhile, as I said. And what I would recommend is kind of like a closing thing. You don't have to use any of these. The amps sound really, really great just by dialing them up and using the basic menu. But it's nice to at least have in the back of your mind that, say you rock up to a gig and your normal patch that you're using isn't quite cutting it the way you would, and you want the character and the normal kind of tone that you've got going on, but you need to shape it very subtly for the application that you're using. It might be that the room you're in sounds really boomy, or you're playing with a different drummer who's louder or quieter than normal. Knowing that these parameters are here and knowing what they do can help you a lot in that kind of situation where it's like, I need the low end to be tighter. How do I want to do it? Or I want to kind of squishier response from the amp, or I need to pull out certain frequencies at the amp block rather than doing it at a mixing desk or anything like that. Just knowing that you've got this kind of all these tools available and this sort of like depth of the unit to do all this kind of stuff is pretty amazing. So I hope this has helped. If you did enjoy the video, hey, look, the dynamic presence has gone down all on its own. Why'd I do that? As I said, if you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comments. Let me know if any of these work for you in your rig. And hit the subscribe button. Check out my other Axe FX3 tutorials and enjoy this absolutely amazing machine. One last thing, I did say I was going to show you guys with a non-master volume amp what the speaker compression parameter does. So let's dive into there. I've got the 50 watt plexi dialed up. This is what it sounds like with the speaker compression at 0. So that together with a supply sag is really, really powerful with these amps. And we can also variac it. And this just adds sort of like compression and adds to the overall feel of the unit. I love how amp-like this is because at the end of the day, that's what we're going for with this. We want this to sound like real amp. So with the variac there, I'll probably have to bring the level up a little bit. Bit of supply sag, bit of speaker compression. It gets you right into that kind of glorious cranked amp without having to go deaf territory. One last thing with the plexis, they can get a bit boomy in the low end, so you can also just use the cut control to control the low end. It does this. Or you can also add some input EQ. That trick works really well too. This is a magic device. Thank you guys so much for sticking around. I will see you all very soon.